Na-Yeon slowly woke up as her alarm kept on ringing. She just stared at the ceiling of her tent for a few moments as it rang, not really wanting to move. Eventually, she reached for it and shut it off as she sat up in her bed. She looked to her side and saw some food already placed by her makeshift bedside. Na-Yeon smiled because she knew who had done it, and she appreciated the girl more and more every day. She got out of her blankets and proceeded to start eating as she thought over what had happened since they had escaped the city. It had been 4 months since then, 4 months since they had barely escaped the city with their lives. She could remember how happy she felt when she had seen the soldiers even after they had shot at them. They had thought that this was happening all over the world and had just been aiming to get somewhere safer than a city. But they later found out from the soldiers that they had managed to contain it in their city before it could spread further. She also knew that it meant they had left them to die. At first, it had made the group mad for a few months till they saw the selfishness they had to save themselves. They had thought the soldiers might kill them, since that was what the soldiers on the roof had said back to them. But as the hours passed, and more survivors had come out of the shadows and ruins of the crumbling, bombed-out city, the government had reluctantly decided not to kill them, especially as some people had managed to capture footage of what was happening with the survivors and leaked it out to the rest of the world. The backlash must have been severe, because she remembered a story about one of the generals killing himself because of this, and the army immediately moved from waiting on the edge of whether to kill them or spare them. But they had been something about some zombies hiding as people that went crazy and attacked people in the camp, and they immediately knew it was someone like Namra and Guinam. So because of that, none of them could immediately be sent into the city and as far away from this hell as possible. The army and people had decided that they would be kept inside the infected zone and a refuge built for them inside. Obviously, the survivors had been angry about being forced to stay inside the camps, and as the months passed, some of the survivors had been angered by the situation that it pushed them to violence. They were quickly put down, while others accepted it. Because for the others, being under guns and guard was better than hiding like rats in the city to avoid being eaten. They were mothers and fathers without families and children without parents. The army had made sure to test all of them thoroughly to the point that it seemed like torture, and all of them held out while others were taken by the army and never seen again. The first time they had been allowed to talk with people on the outside, she had been so excited that she woke up early to be at the front of the line to use the computer to video call. They were still kept in an information blackout to avoid anything more about the area or their situation leaking out to the public. After waiting a while for an hour or two super early in the morning, she was welcomed into the room where 2 guards stood at the ready with rifles staring at her as she sat down on a single chair and desk centered in the room. The guards stood at each corner on the opposite side of the room with a large mirror that she now knew was a one-way window. They were watching her. They were watching everyone. She sat down at the computer, and moments later she saw the call start. She knew they were monitoring whatever she said, but she wasn't planning on leaking anything. She just wanted to talk to her family. Her dad's face filled the screen with her mom sitting by his side, and she immediately began to cry. She saw her father crying as well, not even having said a word as he tried to reach for her through the screen. "Dad," she said between her cries. "Princess." She wanted more than anything to go home right then. She was so glad that her family had been traveling when this disaster had started and not been caught up in its craziness. Most people had not been that lucky. Na-Yeon could see her mother trying to hold on to her regal ways, but could also see the tears streaking down her face as she tried to face away. Even now she was trying to be regal, which caused a laugh to burst out of her through her cries. Because even if she hated it, she was happy for something so familiar. "How are you doing? Are they treating you okay? Are you safe? How did you get out? Do you need me to get you out?" As her father rushed through questions, she had no doubt that he could get her out if she just said the word, but she wasn't going to leave the others just yet. "No, Dad, they are treating me okay. I'm okay," she said the last part, trying to reassure herself and him at the same time. She started talking with her father for a while, telling him everything that had happened, but leaving out Gyeongsu and Cheong-san because she wasn't quite ready to tell him that. She didn't want him to hate her. Not him. Especially not him. "You have 10 minutes left," one of the guards shouted at her, breaking her out of her reverie. Na-Yeon nodded at the guard before facing her parents again. The whole time she had only talked to her father, and her mother had been sitting quietly gripping her father's hand, making sure not to meet her eyes. "Dad, can you let me speak to Mom?" she asked. As she looked at her father, he understood immediately the reason why she asked and moved to stand. Her mom gripped her father's hand and stared at him as if trying to stop him from leaving, but he left nonetheless. Now it was just the two of them looking at each other. Well, one of them was, and the other was looking around nervously. "Mom, I've just been to hell and back. The least you could do for me is look at me." She could see her mom nervously rubbing her arm, still not making eye contact, but glancing up once in a while. But her mother finally looked up and looked at her as if for the first time in a long time. "How are you?" her mother had asked, almost scared. "I'm fine," she replied nervously, and then they sat for a few minutes in uncomfortable silence. She knew that after all the problems that they had over the years, even a situation like this wouldn't bring them together immediately. But she saw how her mother was acting, and it warmed her heart a little because now she knew that she at least cared. "Listen, Mom, I have to go now. There are a lot of people waiting," Na-Yeon said as she went to sit up. "Na-Yeon, wait!" Her mother whispered a shout and she heard it. She turned back to the screen and looked at her mother, who looked torn, and for the first time, the regal mask cracked. "I'm glad that you're okay. I'm happy. So happy," she said, and Na-Yeon could only smile a bit at the statement, even as her mother didn't meet her eyes. "I'm happy you are too," Na-Yeon said, and she could see the moment of shock that froze her mother's features as she stared at her before the call was cut. "Time to go. There are others in the line," a guard said as he ushered her outside. That soon became her weekly trek with the others. Each time her mother always kept quiet when she showed up for the calls, always seemingly uncomfortable. Na-Yeon and her father tried sometimes to make her not feel left out of their talks, but she barely replied, or only supplied a few words. She could also see the uncomfortable air that was around her parents now when they sat together. She hoped that it didn't lead to what she thought might happen. Her relationship with her fellow group of survivors over the past few months had also not started off at the best. Even An-jo had distanced herself from her when she knew they were now both in relative safety, but she always hovered around some distance away, watching her. An-jo watched out for her in some capacity, rushing out to her tent when she screamed from her nightmares to wake her up. She preferred that rather than when the guards did, because it wasn't uncommon among the survivors in the camp. She remembered how being alone felt after only a few days of finally having people around her who wanted to help her, even if that was reluctantly. Na-Yeon missed Cheong-san more with each passing day whenever she thought of him. She was so happy that he had taken the chance on her. But she wished he had made it instead of her. She remembered the feeling of freedom and happiness when they made it that only lasted a few moments before it was replaced with that crushing loneliness. The void that had been filled the past few days. She didn't want to eat on some of those days, as she remembered all that she had seen and all that had happened, but they were all forced to by the soldiers for observation. Na-Yeon, looking back, was glad for that because it kept her body healthy, and for that, she was glad because of what she found out just a month after being saved by the soldiers.